So today I'm presenting my team's work. I'm a research fellow at Boston University School of Public Health, as was mentioned, and I'm working with Lizzie, who's a graduate student, and we're fortunate to be mentored by Dr. Julia Raifman. And today I'll present our work, which is very much still in progress, but it's about racial disparities in bereavement due to COVID-19 and the implications that that has for mental health. So we've seen this consistent trend across the United States that shows that Black, Indigenous, and Latino populations account for a disproportionate number of COVID-19 related deaths relative to their white counterparts. Research suggests that these patterns can be attributed both to pre-pandemic disparities in underlying health conditions and structural racism and other factors that prevent communities of color from physical distancing. So in the wake of so many unexpected deaths, particularly in communities of color, we want to consider what this means for those who are mourning the loss of a loved one. From prior research, we see an association between bereavement and adverse physical and mental health outcomes, including depression and anxiety. There hasn't been much research in the current COVID-19 landscape about this relationship between bereavement and mental health outcomes, but there is preliminary evidence to suggest that bereavement in the context of the pandemic might be associated with increased suicidal ideation. Amidst past epidemics, and this finding actually comes from Ebola research, it's been shown that relatives who do not have the opportunity to be present or say goodbye to their dying family member, their risk of depression is even further elevated. The aims of our research are twofold. So first, to describe the burden of COVID-19 bereavement by race and ethnicity, and then secondly, to evaluate the extent to which COVID-19 bereavement is associated with depression and anxiety. We believe this is important research because we speculate that this excess burden of death due to COVID-19 may put bereaved individuals at an elevated risk for impaired mental health, and it may exacerbate existing racial disparities in mental health. So we use the UAS COVID survey data. I'll kind of skip some of the survey methodology as it was nicely explained in yesterday's session. We did run a longitudinal analysis with the full data set, and then we also took a closer look at the most recent wave of data, which at the time of putting together our abstract was wave 13, which spanned a month of September. And as we continue to revise our work, we'll update the data accordingly. We included all participants who had complete reporting for race, age, exposure, and outcome data. And we excluded participants who said that they had more than 1,000 close friends or family members. The survey already did a soft check to try to exclude some of those extreme responses, but for the few participants who said that they have thousands friends or family members, we didn't include this for the purposes of our analysis. So as the goals of our study come in two parts, so does our methodology. We first looked at an association between race and ethnicity and bereavement, which we defined as the death of at least one friend or family member. And then in the second part of our analysis, bereavement actually becomes the exposure. And we looked at a relationship between bereavement and depression and anxiety. For the depression and anxiety variable, we used the 4-part patient health questionnaire, which has a maximum score of 12, depending on the frequency of symptoms the patient report. And for any participants who reported a score of 6 or more, we considered them to have our depression and anxiety outcome. We first ran a negative binomial regression model, which we offset by the log of the number of close friends or family members that each participant reported. And here we adjusted for age and sex. Secondly, we ran our longitudinal analysis with the full data set, which was a linear model with individual fixed effects to adjust for time invariant individual characteristics, and also survey wave fixed effects to adjust for national secular trends in exposure to bereavement and our outcome of interest. Here we additionally adjusted for job loss. This is just a brief look at the demographic characteristics of our sample, which was predominantly older white females. We found that about 12% of non-Hispanic Black participants reported at least one death due to coronavirus among their family members and close friends, followed by about 9% of Hispanic participants, 6% of Native American participants, a little over 3% of Asian and Pacific Islanders, and about 2.5% of non-Hispanic white participants. We found that bereavement among Hispanic and non-Hispanic Black participants was more than 4-fold that of non-Hispanic white participants. And we found that bereavement was associated with a 2.4 percentage point increase in depression and anxiety, which is equivalent to a 16% relative increase from the baseline levels of depression and anxiety in the sample. So as we think more about how to interpret these results and discuss our findings, as I mentioned, there's little existing research that we can compare our findings to in the specific context of COVID-19. But we think it's important to consider the impact of the collective and generational trauma among marginalized communities that's fueled by systemic racism. So we know that communities of color have experienced a disproportionate burden of death, not just from COVID-19, but for centuries. And so we don't want to just look at COVID-19 as an isolated incident, but instead think about how the effects of death in these communities might be cumulative. We also look forward to expanding our team of researchers and bringing in experts who can speak to the cultural differences between perspectives on grief, resilience, and mental health, and can add perspectives about what death looks like in Black communities compared to Indigenous or Hispanic communities, and the different implications that would have on mental health with respect to those specific cultures. So I just want to thank the Center for Economic and Social Research for the data set and for hosting this conference as well. And I'm happy to take any questions at this time.